there was this quote that I read from Adam Grant where he said, emotions are often a call for reflection, not a call to action. And so what if I can feel something and say, okay, you know what? Fear is here. Concern is here. The unknown is here. What if I recognize it, respect it, allow it, but don't translate that to mean, oh, danger, don't do that, don't go there, because there's a lot that could be under the surface of why discomfort or fear is showing up. That's a sign of danger. It's not a sign to do or not do something. It's just a sign to recognize that, okay, that's showing up. And maybe I'll be able to unpack it at some point, and maybe I won't.
Yossi, I want to dive into some questions, but before we do, would you mind sharing a little bit of your background with us and how you got started in leadership, and particularly the neuroscience aspect? Because that's what I want to dive into, that and talking about self-awareness. It's a topic that comes up quite often, and I'm sure there's a science behind it that we can all understand better. But before we dive into that, I really want to understand your career trajectory and how you dove into that aspect and understanding leadership so much better, to help coach us and help companies get better at being leaders.
Absolutely. So I started off my career in IT in the early 90s, did that about 10 years or so, then, or nine, did a stint in technical sales, and then moved into engineering. And a few years into that, I had an opportunity to get more involved in people responsibilities, as they would call them, and very quickly got feedback that it actually wasn't a strength for me. It was said more directly, as engineers tend to do. And the curiosity for me was, as an engineer, I was able pretty much to go from either watching somebody do something and then being able to repeat it, or read a manual and do it. That was all easily translatable. When it came to the people stuff, whether it's being a good listener, having patience, what we call that, you mentioned self-awareness, how to be more aware of myself and what's going on. What I quickly discovered was the books and the watching other people didn't translate to knowing how to do it. So the understanding of what the thing is to the behavior change, I realized I didn't know how to do. And that was a quandary and a conundrum, as it were. So I went and luckily had a broad networking group of people that I could talk to, and people who were in a very different, not engineering space, gave me some direction that led me to taking a workshop on emotional wellness therapy. And as I embarked on this, I got quite a new level of insight on my started getting a new level of insight on myself, recognizing that I really didn't actually know my emotions so well, wasn't really attuned to them, couldn't really even name them when they were showing up. And that kind of hooked me. I'm not really sure why, but it did. And as I continued in that work, in that exploration work, I ultimately signed up to go through a whole training course that would lead to a therapeutic certification at the end. And that really, I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about my emotions and how to actually feel and process my emotions. I learned a lot about limiting beliefs and the roles that those play on how I might respond and react. And along the way, it was about a 5-year learning process. Along the way, I started becoming very curious about the body, the hardware side of this whole thing, because there were certain experiences that I didn't know how to understand really well. One of them was the role of our emotions versus our thoughts. So, for example, in making a decision that I want to eat healthier or not do certain behaviors or whatever, didn't stop the emotional pull that those things had with them. So walking in the supermarket saying, I'm not eating chocolate right now, but still every time walking past the chocolate aisle, like feeling a deep draw to go get that chocolate. And to me, that was a very odd thing. Like, why isn't making a decision sufficient enough to shift my whole body, my whole self into that commitment? So I wanted to understand that. And I also really wanted to understand what was the role of these different chemicals that I would be hearing about: serotonin, dopamine, cortisol. Like, what was the role that those were playing on the system? Again, thinking about it from a technology perspective, if a computer overheats, I understand it's going to shut down. So is this like overheating? Like, what is that? And that's what led me to also start studying neuroscience, which was to give me those answers. And I learned a lot about what is the role of our whole holistic lifestyle on being a thriving person, a thriving brain, resilient, etc. Also, really understanding why is it that our emotional drives and influences is very different than our cognitive understanding and decision making. So I finished all of my studies at the end of 2010, and my life was completely different. I was different. The way I was relating to my family, the way I was responding at work, the way I was acting at work, the role I was helping with other leaders at work had all very much shifted. I didn't really think about changing my job. This was just like being better at something, but I did want to continue helping leaders. So HR said to me, if you really want to do that, go get a coaching certification. So at least, there's something that backs you taking on that extra work. So I did that, finished my first one in the end of 2012. And about a year and a half later, the company I was in got acquired by a larger company. And that acquisition was pretty bumpy from the employee perspective, from our culture shift perspective. And so morale really went down. And I decided to offer the leaders of my company coaching to see if that would help them. And a number of them took me up on it and very quickly came back and said this was very, very helpful. And that was really kind of the first time that, I don't know, I got like a light bulb that said, oh, coaching could be a real thing rather than just like a side gig. Luckily, after a couple of other events of me going out and helping employees go through this transition, HR came to me and asked me to do it full time. And that pretty much ended my engineering career and started my leadership development career. And it really was focusing on initially helping the leaders in the teams go through this change acquisition and integrate into the bigger company. After that was deemed complete, I then took on a lot of change management responsibilities, focusing on the human side of change. And because the company was global, multinational, I spent a lot of time, in addition to the US, in other countries: Canada, Mexico, England, France, Germany, Amsterdam, Israel, parts of India, Hong Kong, China, Malaysia, and started really learning the role of culture and gender and generation on communication skills, on teaming skills. And so for the next 6 years, that's what I was doing. I was working with leaders and teams across different cultures, helping them become more effective. And I did it in different parts of the organization, whether it was engineering or operations or customer success, et cetera. And for me, I didn't have a exit plan per se, but I did leave the company at the end of 2020 and then found myself thinking, okay, so what job do I want now? And I never thought of actually going to be an independent coach at that point still. So I got a job as an HR leader, and a few months into that, I got offered a chief technology officer role. And I really wasn't sure I wanted to go back into technology leadership, and I did want that role. So I did take it, and it was amazing from a learning experience perspective. And it did also help me realize that I did actually want to spend my full time coaching. And so that allowed me to, I guess, have the guts to quit, and been doing this ever since. So yeah, that's the journey. That's how I discovered it, and the process of going from one complete different space to this space.
That is a great story, Yossi. Thank you for sharing that with us. It sounds like all of your skill sets really culminated in finding your purpose and your passion in that sense. And I like how you describe wanting to understand our human mind and how that works. And being an engineer, it sounds like your interests were still aligned and you were able to use that skill set and understanding how things work to understand better how leaders work. And you mentioned self-awareness, I mentioned it. How does self-awareness, how does it work in our mind? How do we get to that point, and how can leaders use it to make better decisions for themselves and others when it comes to leading a company or even a small team, or maybe it's not even leading people, but starting with ourselves, a person? How do we lead ourselves better with that kind of self-awareness?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to try and use an analogy, one which I'm less skilled at. using baking, for example. I watch my wife do this all the time. And what I notice is if one has an understanding of how different ingredients mix together, the order in which they need to go to have an effective result, what happens if you add a little more salt or a little less salt, all of that comes out in a product that either is tasty or not tasty. And understanding, what is the role of maybe different weather temperatures outside and how much time that might lead to, like, let's say if you're making bread, the rising pieces. So the more that you understand the play out between different ingredients and all of those things, then the better you will get a result out as a cook or a baker, right? So self-awareness is like that. The more that we can understand what is the mechanisms that will help us be a better listener, that will help us be more patient, that will help us be more curious, that will help us be more resilient, that will help us recognize when I might be making assumptions that are not getting me to the right result, or when I'm working with my team and I'm asking them to do something or execute something and I'm not getting the result that I expected. If I can understand what is happening internally with me, and then even to be able to extrapolate that, not that the same thing is happening with you, but that the same mechanisms are probably at place. The more that you understand yourself, the more that you understand what might be internally interfering with the results that you want. And if you know what that is, then you can work on that to get that result that you want. So that to me is the power of self-awareness, is A, to know what it is. And then if you decide that you want to put in the effort to actively engage with that part of yourself to get a different result than you might be getting today.
It also sounds to me like it's self-reflection too, because you have to be willing to acknowledge what you're feeling, what you're thinking, and analyze that. Am I wrong? Do you disagree with that?
I agree with you completely. What's funny is in my mind, I actually connect the two automatically, meaning if I'm aware of something and I'm not reflecting on it, then am I really aware of it? It's kind of like saying, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a noise? Does it make a difference? I'm not around to hear it. So, right. So if I can be aware of myself, but I never reflect on myself, what is my self-awareness?
Is that something that we could fall into and get paralyzed from in terms of decision making?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the idea of analysis paralysis is real, right? We can always overanalyze something to a degree where we don't make an action or a move. And so the there's understanding that I'm having emotions. There's understanding what those emotions are. There's understanding where those emotions are coming from. And there's a lot of different approaches to this and mindsets. And what I have learned to do, let's say, is to start to be able to create some separation space between what am I feeling and why am I feeling it. And if we really understand the neuroscience between where's the part of our brain that is feeling things and where's the part of our brain that thinking things, and understanding that how they kind of connect and don't connect, they more like pass messages to each other. And so when we are trying to sit there and rationalize or stare at our belly buttons to understand, why am I feeling this way? Why am I always right? Can lock us into analysis paralysis where we don't we essentially blocks ourselves from taking action, taking risks, doing things that are uncomfortable. And part of deeper self-awareness is being able to understand that what if I tried or experimented with recognizing what I'm feeling without trying to understand why I'm feeling it right now? What if there was this quote that I read from Adam Grant where he said, emotions are often a call for reflection, not a call to action.
I love that.
And so, what if I can feel something and say, okay, you know what? Fear is here. Concern is here. The unknown is here. What if I recognize it, respect it, allow it, but don't translate that to mean, oh, danger. Don't do that. Don't go there, because there's a lot that could be under the surface of why discomfort or fear is showing up. That a sign of danger. It's not a sign to do or not do something. It's just a sign to recognize that okay, that's showing up. And maybe I'll be able to unpack it at some point, and maybe I won't. Understanding it and feeling it and understanding that it could impact my reaction or my actions is part of that self awareness piece for me. And so, even the idea of what is self awareness, I think, is not necessarily so simple to define. And reflecting on self awareness, also not so simple to define.
Absolutely. And I hope that for the audience too, it expands on the understanding of self-awareness because I talk a lot about it with other guests and it always comes up in some form or fashion. And we haven't really talked about the science behind it or understanding what it is. And I think we can often take for granted what self-awareness is or who has it or do I have it or getting into the pitfalls of overthinking. So I appreciate you explaining it and explaining it in a way that we can all approach because I'm sure it gets way more complicated like you're saying. But if we want to start now with developing our self-awareness, how would you counsel us or coach us? Are there a couple of questions that would help us sort of all get started in reflecting better about our own emotions and thoughts?
So I would start with focusing on the what and not the why. What am I feeling right now? Can I recognize it? Can I understand it? Can I allow it to be without having to shove it away, push it away, or react to it? To me, is the very first question of growing our self awareness, which is, can I recognize what I'm feeling? Can I give it a name? Then can I just allow it to be? What if I don't try to disassemble it and understand all the why behind it? What can I do next with the recognition and the acceptance, and then choose what action I want to take regardless of what I'm feeling? If we can get there and start to get comfortable with that self exploration, to me, that opens this big door ahead of really being able to put into practice, a saying, which is, we can't always choose what happens to us, but we can always choose what to do or how to respond and react. And I think in theory, that's a true saying, but in practice, if you don't know how to recognize emotion and how to allow it without acting, then that isn't a true statement to say to people.
That's really helpful practical advice and additional understanding. I feel like because self awareness is a topic that comes up often, it must be something that we all have to at some point face. Maybe we're handling or managing a team and they don't have self awareness, or as a leader, we don't have that. Maybe we have a bad boss who has no self awareness and you're kind of stuck in that situation. How do you sort of navigate as a team or as a group struggling with somebody else who doesn't have that self awareness? How do you help coach someone that maybe they're not listening to this podcast, they haven't come to that realization, reflection themselves, and you want to gently maybe bring some awareness to them without hurting their feelings, without putting them on the spot, obviously without, embarrassing them. Is there a way to actually do that? Or do we have to let people come to that themselves?
I don't know if there's a right answer. I don't know if there's even a good answer. When we are working together, working with people, there is a necessity of interacting. And interacting will always have a mixed set of results. So I cannot control you. I cannot control anybody else. It's a big enough challenge for me to learn how to control myself, honestly. So the first challenge, and often what I would say mistaken mindset we have, is our desire to control other people. And anybody who's a parent or a pet owner understands, I am not able to control what's in my house. How am I going to control the people in my office? So we have to move away from the idea that I'm trying to control and move into the space of what I can do is influence. But influence is indirect, it's inexact, it's a fluffy thing. So if I want to engage with somebody, and I'm also not a mind reader. And this is another, by the way, big challenge that I find working with people is almost anybody I work with displays a mindset or approach of assigning reasoning and motivation to other people's actions and behaviors. However, because I haven't yet anybody met anybody who's a mind reader, what really comes out is that they're making up a story. They're making an assumption. They're just making stuff up about what in. And people will say, but I know because X, Y, or Z. And I'm like, you know, or you're like making some connections in your head with X, Y, and Z. Like if you really take X, Y, and Z apart, how much do you really know? Is not that much about anybody else and their reasoning, their motivation, and their thinking. So, what I do have is observable reality. I observe you having a behavior, I observe you doing something. And so, really, kind of in a sense, moving a little bit away from self awareness, what I can share with you is what I observe and the impact that it has on me.
But I do wanna point out or emphasize that I like how you understand and draw our attention to the understanding that we're telling ourselves stories, and we're likely telling ourselves a story about somebody else so that we can make it make sense. I imagine that can get us into more trouble because we're assuming. We think we know, like you said, we think we know, but do we really know? And that's where getting insight, asking questions, having those conversations, I think comes into play. But you're bringing up the understanding of observation based feedback. And that's something that I use and I've talked a little bit about, but haven't really devoted an episode to it. So I would love you to explain what that looks like and maybe even where it comes from and how we can be better at giving that type of feedback. Why it's even important to give that kind of feedback.
Absolutely. So, I learned it at Cisco. I don't know who developed it, honestly. And it was a great epiphany for me because if I want to use a word, and it's a dangerous word because I'm not sure where we get the real meaning of it, but truth. So I do think there is such thing as objective truth. I just don't think that we as people have access to it because everything that we think and see is really subjective perception. And so even our concept of truth is subjective ultimately. If I therefore would say to you, Rebecca, when you did that, that was bad. That was wrong. That was the wrong thing to do. How do I actually know the truth of that for you? So, if I really want to, let's say, speak my version of truth, all I have is my observations. And all I also have is my experiences. So, let's say even the team says to me, Rebecca's too hard to work with. We don't know how to talk to her, etc. Again, my interpretation of what they're saying is my interpretation of what they're saying. And because I'm not in their heads, I can't really speak from their point of view to somebody else. Therefore, ultimately, if I want to be as accurate as possible, as straightforward, let's say as honest, as truthful, all I have is my observations of others, of the world. And so if I really want to share something that I think can help another person, then it's not going to be filled with guilt or blame or judgment or assessment. It's going to be filled with here's what I observed and here's how I experienced it. Now the question is that what you wanted? Is that what you intended? Etc. Because then you now have a choice to reflect and do something with it. But if I tell you what you did was wrong, that's a whole other thought process that goes in our brain. Wrong? What made it wrong? Why am I wrong? Who says I'm wrong? Who's the judge of wrong? And especially when I go, and everybody else feels this way too. Really? Everybody? I know everybody. I've asked everybody. I've deep dived it. And we often, I find, do the everybody thing when we don't feel we have enough observation points or data to get you to understand what I want you to understand, going back into that control mindset again. So for me, observation based feedback is really goes hand in hand with that self awareness piece of who am I and where am I in the construct or in the play out of people dynamics and team dynamics. And what is it that I'm really trying to achieve? Am I trying to help myself be better, help the team be better? If that's really the case, then speaking from what I know to be versus what I don't know to be, then all I have is observations. Does that help?
Absolutely. I imagine it's people on the defensive too. If you were to come at them and say, this is wrong, this is bad, and make that judgment call before you've gotten any kind of insight. So the importance of understanding and giving someone an opportunity to share their point of view. And I think this actually, maybe this also answers the other question I had. How do you help someone develop that self awareness? You're giving them an opportunity to reflect on how their behavior, their actions might have come across to yourself or other people, and it opens up a conversation, a dialogue, versus I'm talking at you and I'm telling you why I think everything you did is wrong. And you're not going to set that person up for a good conversation, whether it's with radical candor, like Kim Scott talks about, or just having a meaningful conversation with someone who works for you or with you.
Agreed. Agreed. I think that it has been my experience that if I am trying to help another person, triggering them, putting them into fear mode or fight and flight mode doesn't get that result almost ever. And if I'm working towards an environment where people are more self-directed, are taking personal responsibility and accountability, deepening engagement, wanting or hoping that the people around me will go above and beyond, then the more that I empower them for themselves with ideas like self reflection, with safety, which comes about when we don't employ judgment, etc., then that really can make a huge shift in my environment if I stick to things like observation based feedback along with my self awareness and my reflections on what is going on inside of me? Why would I even want to tell you you did something wrong? Where is that coming from? Where's the driver of that? And again, so that for me, they really are very interrelated pieces of the self-awareness of what I would define as a good leader versus a task manager or a manager or something of that nature.
Is there another element that we should be aware of that would apply to those other two, the observation and the self awareness? Is there something else that we should be mindful of or that we could put into practice as leaders to maybe approach it even more holistically?
Yeah. For me, the thing that comes to mind as you say that is the awareness of ambiguity. And what I mean by ambiguity is using words that has a meaning in your head, but we haven't ensured that the meaning is shared. And what's funny is that when people become aware of looking for ambiguity, we find it everywhere all the time. Leadership, it's an ambiguous word. What does it mean? How do you define it? Especially when I observe people having conversations, is it is filled with ambiguity. And the problem or the challenge of this type of ambiguity of be more strategic, be, more on time, is that you have automatically come up with a meaning in your head. I hopefully have a meaning in my head, but at no point have we like said, hey, is my meaning your meaning and your meaning my meaning? I've rarely seen that done automatically before we have this conversation and people start to think about it, which means that we are operating on a tremendous amount of ambiguity, which often leads to friction because the results are not what we wanted. And it's not because the other person didn't listen or isn't skilled or etc. It's because things weren't defined.
That is a wonderful point. And I'm thinking I've definitely come across that situation working in teams and leading teams. Also, if you're in a service based industry, especially, or any kind of industry where you're working with clients and directly customers, there can be so much ambiguity in the feedback that you get from others, where whether it's like, make it better, like you said, or I want my content to look cool, or my campaign needs to be optimized. Any of those words, any of those, they can have some kind of meaning, but you have to define that for other people and for yourself. And sometimes I feel like we don't even know what we're saying and we haven't actually defined it for ourselves. So you pointing that out makes me think, well, it starts with us and being clearer in what we want. And when we don't know what we want, we should probably tell people we're vague ourselves and we don't have that yet, but let's explore it together. Because I've found I've had more of those conversations and people are a little bit more willing to explore with you than for us to give out, throw away some of these vagaries and hope that people can interpret that for us and do some of that legwork for us instead. What are your thoughts on that?
100%. I couldn't have said it any better than you did it. That's 100% what I would coach people to do. So yeah, exactly that.
Yeah, well, we're saying it great together because you bring it up, Yossi, and I think it's really it's really helpful to not only to have the awareness of it, but to be reminded of it. Because even if I feel like you could be maybe the most self-aware person, but we can all forget, and we can forget that words matter, and what we're choosing to say, whether it's written or verbal, will have an impact on someone. And having that kind of awareness around our words is really important too. And we're all human. We're all going to make mistakes and lose sight of that. But it's a lot of pressure for leaders to have the awareness, not let it cripple you, have the observation, have those difficult, sometimes conversations, and be mindful of what we're saying and how it's coming across. So, how do you help leaders prevent the burnout from all that stress and pressure? Because it can weigh on anyone, whether like I said before, you could be a leader of yourself solely, and even that pressure can be a lot versus leading a team of 10 or more people. So, what are some tips that we could all take away to navigate and prevent the burnout? We don't want to get to the burnout, but how can we prevent it if possible?
Think no, I don't think. My answer to this is often taken or perceived as crossing into therapeutic approaches or mindsets. And honestly, I think the idea of burnout is more an emotional thing than it is a mental thing. I don't actually think our brain per se is burning out. Our thinking brain is burning out. It is our energy, our emotions, and therefore the more that we can understand the emotional side of ourselves, and there's already, we live in a world that has a plethora of these techniques, whether it's in the mindfulness space or in the breathing space or in the exercise space, that it's not just a practice for itself in the sense of like yoga is not just a practice for helping your body and strengthening your body, and in that moment it is an exercise that can in many ways be employed throughout your day. Same thing with breathing or mindfulness or taking a walk or stretching. And the part of the neuroscience of the holistic self is something which is so interesting that in some ways we kind of live a disconnected approach of how to improve my mind, study, read, learn, but I don't do exercise, I don't eat well, I don't sleep well, or I drink a lot or other things. Our brain is not separate from our body. And all of these things really do play a role. So the better, and again, better is a very ambiguous word, but let's say the more attention I give, the more focus, the more awareness, whatever you want to translate those words to, on my holistic being, on what am I eating, putting into my body, is the studies on that showing that that is going to help my body develop and grow stronger, or is it going to make my body weaker or create hardships for my body to process that stuff? As far as we know, the way that our cells heal is through sleep. So, am I giving time for my cells to heal? Am I, every part of us is a muscle. The thinking part, the breathing part, the muscle, the arms, etc. Am I strengthening those parts of me, or am I letting them melt away and get weaker? We don't stay static. We are either getting stronger or weaker. We do not have an equilibrium state as humans, as far as I know. The tips about it is if you are ignoring your whole self, then that will in some way probably lead to a weakness somewhere.
And we have to have that reflection on, are we nurturing and caring for the different elements of our body, our mental, physical, spiritual well being, and all the basic elements that go into creating a healthier lifestyle, whatever that means for us. And I'm really glad you brought attention and awareness to that, because so often it's easy for us to skip a lunch or push ourselves past the waking hours and into the midnight hours, or too much caffeine and overstimulation, and we lose sight of what's healthy for us. And to be cliche, you can't pour from an empty cup, so we have to make sure that
Right.
ours are full too. And I know, Yossi, you have more to give to others and more to pour into them, whether it's coaching or working with their team directly. So, how can people find you online and reach out and start working with you?
So Honestly, Rebecca, the best place right now is LinkedIn. In balancing my life, I do have a website being built and it's a work in progress. So really the place right now is LinkedIn. And on my LinkedIn page, there is a button to book time with me. And so that is a no commitment time that people can just have a conversation. So that's the place right now.
That's great. Well, we will have that link below in the comments. Thank you so much for joining us, Yossi. This has been a great conversation. I've definitely learned and realized a lot more, and I hope that our audience has too. So we will definitely connect further. And thank you to our audience for listening to another episode of Bad Bosses, Great Leaders podcast.